Welcome back to Chuck's Garage and our final installment of the LS Engine Swap Series. Today, Chuck takes us through the remaining steps of wiring and firing up the LS engine with Holley's EFI system.
Hi, I'm Chuck Hansen. Welcome back to Chuck's Garage. You know, it's been a long time since the last time I saw you, but you know, I'm approaching this project probably just like a lot of you approach yours. Things get in the way. It's been a long summer. I've gone to a lot of car shows, had yard work to do, just been traveling a lot, and well, this thing's been put on the back burner in the meantime. But guess what? Today we're going to wire it and we're going to fire it. How to do it? Now, if you're joining us for the first time, let me tell you what we've got going on here. What we did was we took a 5.3 LS engine out of a Tahoe and a 4L60E transmission, and we've slammed it into this 69 Chevelle chassis using motor mounts and an oil pan and other components here from Hooker and Holley. Now, the reason that we did that was to make this swap as easy as possible, reduce the number of headaches, and ensure that we don't have compatibility issues down the road. Now, what I've done today is I've gone ahead and built this little control panel here, and as you can see, it mounts the ignition switch, a couple of gauges. We got an oil pressure and a water temperature gauge, and the fuel pressure regulator here. Now, you see this big void right here? That's where we're going to mount the computer later on. In the meantime, though, what I've done is I've gone ahead and wired a lot of the 12-volt stuff here, and that's where I'm at right now. We'll take a look at some of those wiring harnesses in just a second after I get a couple of things buttoned up. Now, one of the things I've learned over the years of working with electronics is you've got to have good electrical connections. Now, for the starter and the main power source, we're using a 1-gauge power cable here, and the same thing on the negative side here. Now, we've also, our negative ground goes over here to the block, and then we have a single ground wire that comes off of the block and comes back over here to the frame. So we've got that part handled pretty well. And like I say, this 12-volt hot wire here will go down to the battery. This is another power wire here that will go back here and power up the gauges. Now, I've already topped off the engine with oil here and the transmission with fluid, and now we're ready to add coolant to the engine. I'm going to show you a little trick here. Now, filling an LS engine with coolant presents a little bit of a problem because what you have is a thermostat that needs to get the water behind it so it can operate properly and open when it gets hot. If you just fill the radiator with coolant, what happens is the radiator gets full, but it doesn't get down in the block like it needs to, and the radiator eventually will let the engine block open up, but by then the engine could get hot. You don't want a couple of heat cycles there where the engine gets overheated. So we're going to go ahead and fill the block through the upper radiator hose here and get water in the coolant passages like it needs to operate that thermostat properly. Of course, once you get the engine block filled, you can go ahead and top off the radiator with coolant until it's full all the way up. Now, what we're looking at here is the real meat of what we're going to be putting into play today. As you can see, we got a bunch of harnesses here, but the real deal is the ECU. Now, what we're using here is Holley's Alternator EFI V2 computer here, and the reason we're doing this is because not only will it control the basic functions of a fuel-injected engine, like it'll certainly control all the fuel injectors, it'll turn your fuel pump off and on, it'll control the fans, it'll even control an electronic transmission. But beyond that, if you should decide, for instance, that you want to bolt on some nitrous on this thing, it'll control the nitrous. Multiple stages of nitrous. It'll also control power adders like turbochargers. A couple of add-on solenoids will allow you to control the amount of boost through the pop-off valves and stuff. So this is a very, very capable ECU here that'll meet all of our needs and then some, no matter what we decide that we're going to do in the future. And of course, this is the main power harness that will connect to the battery and then plug right up to the computer. What we've got down here is the main harness. This thing has all of the controls that go for throttle position sensor, air inlet temperature, all of that kind of stuff there. All of the sensors and all the controllers all plug up. Now, I want to show you something here. You'll see that each one of these is even tagged, like TPS, that's your throttle position sensor, fuel pressure sensor, the IAC is your idle air control valve. You've got your O2 sensor. So this harness is very complete, and it uses all weather pack connections, and they're all foolproof because they only plug in one way. So down here, we've got the injector harnesses. They plug into the main harness there. And then we have the transmission control harness. We're going to get started by mounting up the ECU here first. Now, one of the things I forgot to mention earlier is that this ECU here will also control drive-by-wire controls here. And it's also self-learning. Now, that's very important because we've tried to make this thing as easy a swap as possible, and all of the Holley ECUs use that self-learning capability here, and I'll show you a little bit more about that later on. The main power harness for the computer comes with plenty of length to trim it to the appropriate length that you need, and as you can see, I've already added the proper terminals. Now, we want to make sure that the computer gets a real clean power source, so we're going to connect this directly to the battery here. And in this particular case, we've got a top terminal with side terminals, so we're going to go ahead and make use of those side terminals and hook it up right here. Now, once that ECU is mounted, we're ready for the main power harness here. You can see this just plugs up like this. Now, the harness also comes with its own 40 amp fuse here as a safety precaution. Now, I'm going to anticipate that things are going to get hot here after we get some heat in the engine after we run it. So we're going to make sure that the harness stays away from those hot exhaust manifolds. We're going to go ahead and zip tie them right here to the upper control arm cross brace right here. There we go. That ought to keep everything away from the exhaust. Looking good. Now, in order to make this whole thing work here, we're going to need a couple of sensors. So we had to go ahead and go down to the local parts store and source this MAP sensor here. It goes right in the back of the intake manifold like this. All right, it has a little O-ring that'll seal this thing up here to the intake manifold. It goes right in this port here, and then you secure it with a 1/4 inch bolt. Well, I guess we're ready for the main harness now. Now, don't let all these connectors intimidate you, because remember what I showed you, they're all marked and they can only go in one location. So, well, let's get after it. All right. Now, we're going to start by plugging in these two main plugs here that go right into the ECU. Our O2 sensor is next. You might remember that the sensor plugs into the exhaust pipe down tube right here, and we just plug it right into the connector that says WBO2, which means wideband O2 sensor. Now, this lead right here goes to the crank position sensor. You can see the crank label on it. For right now, that crank sensor is hidden behind the starter, so we're going to just feed this down here, and we'll plug that in later when we get underneath the car. But for right now, we need to just kind of position it there where we can go ahead and access it later on. Now, you'll also notice that we have a ground here and a ground here. We're going to attach those right to a couple of bolts on the end of the heads here. That'll give us another couple of good grounds here for this electrical system. Now, this part of the harness, as you can see, has a lot of leads that will go towards the front of the engine. So we're going to take this bundle and just kind of fish them up through here and get them up close to the sensors where they need to be. All right, this one says throttle position sensor. This is IAC, your idle air control. Fuel pressure, we've got a mechanical gauge that I'll show you later on. We won't be using that one. And your manifold absolute temperature, we got to use that on our intake here later on. Coolant temperature sensor is down here on the side. Now the nice thing about all these connectors is they work perfectly with all the original GM sensors. Well, this wiring harness really is easy. As you can see, it's even denoted on here which side of the engine this goes. This is ignition on the odd side. All your odd numbered cylinders are over here. And of course, for the other side, it says ignition even cylinders. So we'll kind of head this one over in that direction. For the ignition, it just plugs right into the original coil packs connector here. There it is. All right, we're good. And we'll just do the same on the other side here. Okay, now here at the back of the engine, we've got several more sensors. Here's the NOx sensor. This one comes from underneath the intake manifold. We just plug that one up. There we go. The cam sensor goes right here. And the map sensor. Now remember the map sensor that we used here? This is a late model
LS3
sensor here. What we found out was the plug-in here on the wiring harness is not compatible with this type of map sensor. So let me go over here and get something that I thought was pretty neat. Now Holley actually anticipated the incompatibility between that map sensor and their wiring harness, so they made this little jumper here. Just plugs in like this. There we go. And then the other end just plugs right into the map sensor. And we're good to go on that. We have one final connector, and that's for the oil pressure. It also goes right back into this little sensor right here, snaps into place, and we're done. Well, now we're ready for the injector harness. And you can see that this is all just going to plug in together just like that. Now, what we're going to do is identify right and left bank here. Cylinder 6 and 8, we know those are even numbered cylinders. They're over here, which means the odd numbered cylinders are over here. We're just going to thread this stuff through and hook them up to the injectors. We'll start at the front with cylinder number 2. It just slides over the top of the injector, snaps right into place. And we just follow on down the line. And we just repeat on the other side. Well, all right, we're getting close now. We got one last big harness to deal with, and this is the one that controls the transmission. Now we're going to plug it in right here on the ECU. Well, now since the 4L60E is an electronically controlled transmission, you got a couple of, this is the VSS, which is the speed sensor, and turbine speed inputs here. The main one, though, that's going to control the actual transmission is this big transmission connector right here that we plug the other end into the ECU. It goes right into this connector on this side of the transmission. Well, we've got this bag of snakes back here now that really needs to be tidied up and certainly needs to be kept away from hot objects like the exhaust or even rotating objects there. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time now with zip ties and get things kind of bundled up and tidied up a bit, and I'll be right back. Well, all right. Now, we have one more red wire that comes out of the main harness, and it goes to a direct 12-volt source. So we're going to hook it up on the side terminal part of this battery again, and we ought to be good to go. We have two more wires that come out of the main harness there. This red one with the white stripe will go to a 12-volt switch source, which is going to be this lug right here on the ignition switch. And the black one, of course, is a ground, and we'll take it right here to this mounting bolt right here for the control console. Yeah, I guess I should have mentioned that all these wires come with plenty of length on them for you to trim them to the proper length and then add the appropriate terminals on the end. And I've already done that here, so we'll bolt up this one to the 12-volt switch source, and we'll be one step closer. Well, we have two more wires that we need to concern ourselves with. Actually, not so much this blue one with the white stripe on it. That's your tack lead. We don't have a tack here, so I'm just going to wind this up and include it as part of the wound up bundle right there. And we'll get to that later when we get a body and stuff figured out for this thing. The other part, though, is this green wire. This green wire is actually comes out of the ECU there, and it hooks up to the wire that powers up the fuel pump that's in the tank back here. So we're going to go ahead and strip that down and connect the two up, and then we'll be ready to go with our fuel pump. Well, now that we've got the crank position sensor hooked up, we can throw the starter up into place here. All right, another piece of wiring that we need to take care of before we fire this thing up is the alternator. Now, this yellow wire here goes to a switch 12-volt source over there on the ignition switch, and it just plugs in back here on the alternator. And what it does is it'll carry enough electricity to excite the alternator so we can go ahead and charge it. Now we just need to run a big 10-gauge wire from the charging post here over to the battery. All right, now we've gone ahead and run the big red wire from the alternator over to the battery. That'll get the alternator 12 volts back to where it'll charge the battery. And we've got the yellow wire plugged into the back of the alternator. What I'm doing here now is putting a terminal on the end of this so we can put it to a switch 12-volt source. Well, it won't be long now till we hear this monster fire up, but before we can do that, we're going to go ahead and install this air intake that I purchased off of the internet. Now, this is a pretty universal deal here. It's got a 90-degree bend down here. It's all aluminum. It's got a 30-degree rubber flexible bellow here with a reusable cone filter on this end. Now, I went ahead and I trimmed 2 inches off of this end here to give us the clearance that we need down here between the throttle body and the radiator. Let's see if it's going to work. Oh yeah, that's looking pretty good. We'll go ahead and tighten this up. All right, that looks like it's pretty good on there. Now, you might remember that I showed you that manifold air temperature sensor. Now, it needs to go somewhere along here to give us an indication of how cool or hot the air is. I think I'll go ahead and drill this thing and mount it right here, right before the elbow. That way we'll have plenty of room for the harness lead to get over there. And I'll just take this off, and we can go ahead and drill the hole for the sensor. Now, I've gone ahead and put a mark here where I want to mount that sensor. As you can see, it's right on the back side of that elbow there, so let's go ahead and start drilling this. Now, since this is soft aluminum, what we're going to do is we're going to get this sensor started in here and see if it'll cut its own threads. Feels like it's doing pretty good on it now. Yeah, that's going to work, I believe. Wow, we got lucky. Doesn't get much better than that. All right, we'll just go ahead now and reinstall this air intake. Then all we have to do is plug the lead into the sensor. You know, I'm kind of like one of those weirdos that likes to know everything that's going on with the engine there. So what I want to do is add this little fuel pressure gauge here, so I'll know just about how much fuel pressure we're carrying here. And it goes right here on this outlet port on the fuel regulator. We just have to remove this little plug here, and then we'll be able to screw it right in. We're getting closer to the moment of truth now, so what we're going to do, since we have the gauge here, I'm going to go ahead, we've got all the electrical connections done. I'm about ready to just go ahead and power the accessories up and see if the fuel pump is kicking in and see if it's pressurizing the fuel system. Then we'll go ahead and check for leaks. Yeah, we've got right at 40 psi. I'm not detecting any leaks at any of the connections. So we're pretty good. I'm just about ready to pull the trigger on this thing. Yeah, but before we can do that, we've got one more thing that's absolutely essential to make this LS engine run here, and that's to load the base map into the ECU there. Now, the way you can do that is you got to have a Windows laptop, and you've got to have the software that comes with the ECU. Now, I've got the disk here, but if you've misplaced yours or whatever, it's no sweat. You can download that software off of the internet, off of Holley's website, and just load it into the laptop. But remember, you got to have a Windows machine. If you got a Mac or something, you're gonna have to borrow one from your buddy. Now, that ECU comes with its own cable here that you can use to connect the laptop to the ECU. And it just plugs in right down here in the corner. Well, now that we got the ECU hooked up to the cable, we just take the USB end of that cable and we jack it into the port here on the laptop. Now, when you open up the software, this is what you're going to see. We want to go over here to Open Global Folder, and we just click on it. There we go. Now, we're going to want to find Custom Cal. There it is right there. Now, you're going to get a lot of different calibrations for a lot of different stock applications, but what we're looking for is the one that says LS1 4L60E with a cable throttle body. That's what our application is. We're going to click on that. There we go. Now, that's our basic computer setup there, but before we send this thing down to the ECU, this is our basic map. Before we send it there to the ECU, we want to check a couple more parameters just to make sure we've got everything ready to go. All right, now the first thing that we want to do is to the System ICF icon there. We'll click on it, and that'll open up the engine and actually system parameters. We're going to go to the engine parameters first, and first thing you want to check is that O2 sensor. Make sure it matches the one that we're using. We're using the Bosch, so we'll go ahead and click on that. We're good there. And then we're going to go down to ignition parameters. And there we go. We're using a 24-tooth reluctor. Now, that's the one that we've indicated here. That's what we're using in the engine, so we're good on that. They do make a 58-tooth reluctor, but that's a different application. We're locked in for what we've got. Now, this is going to be, we've got our basic map here, but you remember what I told you earlier about this being a self-learning system? Well, we want to make sure that the self-learning capabilities are activated here so that as soon as we fire this thing up, it's going to start learning and figuring out just exactly what that engine needs from idle all the way through full throttle. So we'll go ahead and get those particular things activated, and we'll be ready to start this thing up. All right, now we're ready to go down to the closed loop learning. And you'll see here that we're in the closed loop, and that box right there means that we've enabled the closed loops, and we're going to learn some new parameters here. Okay, there's the new base map. We've got the base fuel learn enabled, so we're going to go ahead and save this, and then we're going to send it to the ECU. Now, before we can send that program to the ECU here, we're going to have to power up the ECU. make it ready to receive that, and then we go back over here to the computer. All right, there's an icon there that says sync with ECU. We'll just go ahead and send the program. All right, one last thing before we fire this thing up. We have to go ahead and do the TPS auto set. What that'll do is it's going to synchronize the throttle position sensor with the ECU down there, and then this thing hopefully should run. Now what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and click on the start button here. And after we do that, have a friend cycle the throttle a couple of times. Now I'm just going to go back over to the computer here and we'll click on done. All right, we're good. Looks like we're ready to go here. All right, now that we've done the TPS auto set, one more thing, we just need to cycle the key one more time. I think we're ready to crank. Here we go. How about that? That ought to do it. Now, one of the things I noticed when we first fired that up was that our fuel pressure was a little bit on the low side. We want to have about 58 PSI there. This thing was about 47 PSI, so I just went ahead and adjusted it right on the top of the regulator here, and we've got 58 PSI. This thing ought to be good to go. Well, that wraps up things for today. Now, the LS, man, I'll tell you what a sweet deal. It started just like that. It's running good, and now the toughest part is going to be trying to figure out which one of my Chevelles all this needs to go on. But I tell you what, I've been kind of keeping an eye on the old maroon convertible back here in the corner. I think that is going to be a likely candidate. Now, along the way, we've had a lot of fun. We've learned a little bit, and we hope that you've learned a little that'll help make your LS swap a whole lot easier. Thanks for hanging in there with us.